Thank you very much for reconvening and joining us again. It's one of those days where if this was a regular class, the students would be like, can we meet outside today? It's so nice. But we're going to have a lot of fun and be very much enlightened here today. So to introduce the session today, I'm going to call upon the Dean of Arts and Humanities here at VIU, Dr. Ross McKay. He hails originally from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, so he left the abandoned coal mines of Cape Breton to come to the abandoned coal mines of Nanaimo, and it's just been all uphill since from there. So, Dr. Ross McKay.
Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our campus, and we picked a good day you picked a good conference and a good day to start. It's my pleasure to introduce this important panel, and my only regret, and I regret most acutely, is that Mr. Manuel is not with us to share his vision in person. And I want to offer my sincere condolences to Professor Chavez, Scottish, and Mr. Manuel's wide circle of friends for their loss, and it's certainly our loss as well. I'd also like to offer my gratitude to the Nanaimo First Nation for their ongoing openness, generosity, and goodwill. And to the organizing committee of this conference, Kelly Black, Tim Lewis, Haley Millett, and Catherine Rollwagon, I offer my hearty congratulations on a remarkable effort. Anyone who has ever organized a conference will appreciate just how much work is involved, and the program is a splendid and an inspiring one. I would just like to say a few words about Aboriginal education at VIU, and specifically the role of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. We have much to celebrate here, but one of the reasons we do have much to celebrate is that we have always approached this important work as ongoing and incomplete, unsettled, if you will, to employ another register of that clever locution. Vancouver Island University has a history of respectful relationships with regional Aboriginal communities and with creating Aboriginal or First Nation focused curriculum, as well as supports like our Elder in Residence program, all of which have gained us a positive reputation across Canada. Our president, Dr. Ralph Nielsen, has made it one of his priorities to strengthen our relationship with our First Nations communities. Our inaugural chancellor was Sean Atleo, hereditary chief of the Ahousaht First Nation and former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He became the first university chancellor of Aboriginal heritage in the province's history. Our second and current chancellor is Louise Mandel, one of Canada's foremost Aboriginal rights lawyers and a tireless advocate for Canada's First Nations. And in addition to housing BC's Shweequal, or Speaker for Indigenous Dialogue, who happens to be Sean Atleo, and housing the Center for Pre-Confederation Treaties and Reconciliation, whose director is legal scholar Douglas White, we have a new Fulbright Canada Yaroslavsky Visiting Research Chair in Aboriginal Studies, Dr. Roy Janish of Pittsburgh State University. Now, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities houses the First Nation Studies program, which is a community-based program founded in 1993. It pioneered the presence of elders in residence as foundational to all aspects of its endeavors. A team teaching model was and is vital to the viability of its mandate. The program was an innovative attempt to achieve Aboriginal control of Aboriginal education in a public post-secondary institution. The program's aim is to offer students an educational experience grounded in both local Indigenous knowledge and solid academic context. In this way, students carry forward our founding elder, Dr. Ellen White's Nanaimic philosophy of walking in both worlds with both hands full. In September 2015, an agreement was signed according Aboriginal elders in residence a specialty faculty designation. The agreement creates a new classification of employment for the elders in residence, one that formally recognizes them as gifted faculty who provide a unique and highly regarded knowledge contribution to VIU and the VIU community. In addition to the First Nation Studies program, the Office of Aboriginal Education does excellent work to advance Aboriginal education at VIU. It develops community-based education programs, creates a sense of belonging for Aboriginal students on campus, supports faculty in bringing Indigenous ways of knowing and being into their courses, and provides many other supports and services to Aboriginal students. Most recently, it initiated and organized many of the events and activities for our Reconciliation Road project, a series intended to engage people in the reconciliation process and to create a supportive place for people to come together to build understanding around the challenging and critical work of reconciliation. Aboriginal education also regularly offers such programs as the Super Hispanic Lunch and Learn series, protocol sessions, Indigenous book circles, Indigenous portfolio sessions, Indigenous learning circles, and so on. So we are proud of the work we do. However, we are certainly aware that much more work is required if we are to do our part as a post-secondary institution to create conditions whereby First Nation students can achieve their educational goals and realize their dreams and aspirations. As Justice Murray Sinclair said in the TRC report, while education is the cause for much of the challenges faced by Aboriginal people today, it is also the solution in moving forward. And as educators, I believe that we have a responsibility not only to address bias and oversights in our educational systems so that we can provide more opportunities for Aboriginal students, but we must also work to combat misconceptions, stereotypes, and prejudice within society at large. With respect to Canadian history, for instance, too many people are still graduating uninformed of the true history of colonialism and all of its sorry consequences, including the residential school system. And too many of us are closed off to the immense gifts of Aboriginal ways of knowing and being that could enrich our institutions and our lives. As BC physician Gabriel Mété said this week in the Globe and Mail, Canadians must learn about the resonant values, brilliant art, stories, and wisdom culture of First Nations people, and should strive to see their First Nations peers in their fullness, which includes their humanity, grandeur, unspeakable suffering, and strength. Mété's point speaks, I think, to the important social context for our crucial educational work, namely the desperate conditions of many First Nations and Inuit communities. Of course, many of these problems constitute such dire emergencies that they require immediate actions and cannot be solved by academic debates. Yet I can't help but think that the lack of political will that seems to frustrate action to address this crisis is not in part connected to a failure of our education systems to foreground the historical injustices which have been inflicted on our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. And our collective ignorance re-traumatizes, perpetuating injustice in contemporary contexts. And so I have hope that the work you do here over the next few days moves us just a little closer to the goal of healing and of truth and then reconciliation, as well as of real community building, a community that affords social, political, and economic harmony and equality of opportunity. I must say that I am exceedingly gratified by the goodwill that I perceive among all of you, and I am likewise encouraged that the question posed by this particular panel, what are you going to do about it, will bear good fruit. To that end, I will now call upon Chancellor Louise Mandel to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Loath to contradict the Dean, but we made an arrangement that I will quickly do that. I want to acknowledge Coast Salish territory and the hosting of this Nanaimo people, and thank the elders for their prayers. I also want to thank Chancellor Louise Mandel for the introduction she gave to the panel already this morning. She has worked with generations of the Manuel family now, starting with Grand Chief George Manuel, Art's father. She worked with Art all the way through the logging cases, reminds us that there's still charges outstanding, and pending on the logging action that they took. And we are all here to talk about implementing Art's vision and the work we'll continue to do. Also on the panel is Art's son, Skehish, who traveled here with his son and Art's grandson, Skehish Cecil. And also his friend, close friend, Russell Daibo. They've worked together all the way from Secwepemc territory, where Russ worked with Art on a traditional use study, to the national level, and now Russ is getting pulled more and more into the international level as well. Russ and Skehish just traveled to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues in April. Art had been to every session of the Permanent Forum before then, and they went in his place. If it's okay, I'll sit now. So I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Nicole Chavez. I'm Art's life partner, and 4 months ago, I was looking forward to traveling here with Arthur, and to being here with him. And of course, I wish that we were all here with Art and listening to him. But we are also all committed to carrying on his vision and his legacy. And as he would say often when he was asked the question, it's all in my book. So thankfully, we have his book. And Art's book, Unsettling Canada, with us. I recall times when Art would sit with his grandchildren and he would read them from his dad's book, The Fourth World. And then they would sit and they would talk about their great-grandpa. And now they have Desla's book, to keep that work and that legacy that you're already seeing being carried on, going strong. I basically spent my whole adult life working/volunteering with Art and later living with him. And many of us who have worked with Art in the process have really found their purpose in life. And so it's been a great privilege to learn and to keep passing on some of that wisdom and really working, hopefully all of us together, on implementing that vision. I was, like Louise was talking about how she had just come out of law school. I had just come out of law school. And I came and I was looking forward to writing lofty human rights submissions. And one of the first submissions I got to draft was an international trade submission on subsidy law. And not that I was a huge fan of international trade law, but I'll speak to that shortly. But before I get to some of the international work, or the work we've done from the local to the international level, I do want to recap a few points from the beginning, so to say, of this panel that started this morning. And the starting point for working with Art was always organizing from principles. And principle number one is we're dealing with Indigenous land. And Art's life work was really about recognition that this is Indigenous land. Like land rights or the land question doesn't fully cover it. Really, the principle that Art started from and that he always knew deep in his heart and that he would never sway from is that these are the lands of Indigenous peoples, that we all have the privilege as settler people of living on, but we have to recognize that they are Indigenous lands. And on the other hand, what Art would point out is what he often referred to as the 0.2% versus the 99.8%, because in Canada, and Russ has already referred to that, in Canada, the total of Indian reserves amount to 0.2% of the territory of Canada. That means that Indigenous peoples have been deliberately marginalized and cut out from decision-making regarding 99.8% of their territories. There couldn't be a starker contrast. You heard the Dean speak about some of the dire conditions or the hardship that Indigenous peoples face. And you can trace it right back to that, to the economic marginalization, deliberate economic marginalization of Indigenous peoples. And legally, you can trace it back to the doctrine of discovery. That's what Art's book starts with. He starts talking about going international to fight the doctrine of discovery. And that is what our whole system, I'm a lawyer, I should have said I'm a law prof, I teach at the first law school in the interior of British Columbia, in the largest Indigenous territories in the province, where you have huge issues regarding access to lands and resources and territorial decision making, and we were working on these issues together. But our legal system is still based on those doctrines of discovery. And actually, that's a point that is made in the Tsilhqot'in decision. And I briefly want to take you to paragraph 69 of the Tsilhqot'in decision. And they start, and this is the first paragraph of the part of the decision about the legal characterization of Aboriginal title. The starting point in characterizing the legal nature of Aboriginal title is Justice Dixon's concurrent judgment in Guerin, discussed earlier. At the time of assertion of European sovereignty, the Crown acquired radical or underlying title to all the land in the province. This Crown title, however, was burdened by the pre-existing land rights of Aboriginal peoples who occupied and used the land prior to European arrival. So, and then they say, oh, and the doctrine of terra nullius has never applied, which is one sub-doctrine of the doctrine of discovery. But really, they are not stepping away from the doctrine of discovery. They are saying at the moment of assertion of sovereignty, which is a legally chosen moment, that the Crown acquired underlying title. And what they are talking about there is jurisdiction, decision-making regarding all the land, 100% for that matter. And I would call this colonial reverse engineering. When in the artificial moment of assertion of sovereignty, the previously underlying title and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples is flipped into the air, flops off the legal radar, and underlying Crown title and sovereignty magically take their place. That's the doctrine of discovery. That's the colonial paradigm that the legal system is still based on. And in Tsilhqot'in, they then separate that point about jurisdiction and decision-making out from Indigenous proprietary interest, and they suggest, like in the previous jurisprudence, which actually traces all the way back to Chief Justice Marshall in the Johnson versus McIntosh decision in the 1830s, where the doctrine of discovery first came in the North American context. They are still tracing it back to that, and that paradigm still needs to shift. So we are still within a colonial frame, and Art was very clear about that. There is still a lot of work to do. We are not at a stage where we can say, oh, we are now working towards reconciliation. I'm very leery as a lawyer every time the term reconciliation is used, because every time it's used in the jurisprudence, including of the Supreme Court of Canada, it is in the context of justification of infringement. And Chief Justice Lemaire in Gladue, when he talks about reconciliation, I like to call it kind of reverse reconciliation, he's actually saying Indigenous peoples have to get used, so to say, to the fact that there is now settlers and they have to share, and so there is circumstances in which we can justify the infringement of their rights. That is still the colonial paradigm. And what we need to work towards is shifting out of that paradigm. And so, and that paradigm still leaves governments as the sole decision makers regarding access to lands and resources. I just sat in a panel where there was a lot of talk about the referral process and consultation processes. They are all still based on the presumption that the Crown is the sole decision maker. And although the Haida decision that Louise worked on challenged the business as usual approach that the province wanted to continue with after Delgamuukw, I suggest that their consultation processes have become the new business as usual, because it still leaves the government as the sole decision maker that doesn't fully take into account underlying indigenous land rights and indigenous decision making regarding access to lands and resources. That is what prior informed consent is about. That is what is articulated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Skahish, when he talked about this colonial paradigm and how you are still faced with it as an indigenous person of his generation today in this province called British Columbia that we're talking about unsettling. And so basically, what we need to think about is how can we shift out of that and recognize indigenous peoples as decision makers. And what art would revert to is international human rights standards, including some of them that are binding on Canada. I suggest that in part the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, although a political declaration, can be a powerful instrument. It can be seen as enshrining international legal principles that should be binding on Canada. But Canada is also a signatory to covenants that recognize what is known as the right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination at international law is the remedy to colonialism. And for the longest time, governments were denying that, nation states were denying that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. The way it's articulated in the UN covenants is, it says all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they can freely determine their political, economic, social status, organization and standing, etc. Now, nation states denied that indigenous peoples are caught under this term, all peoples. They denied their nationhood, their standing. But indigenous peoples, going all the way back to Grand Chief George Manuel, and Art continued that work, and now Skahish and others are continuing in that vein, made it very clear that they have that standing at international law. And by now, we have an international state consensus around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which in its Article 3 says, and that was the most heavily debated article in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada resisted it for 20 years. It says all indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. There can today no longer be a debate whether at international law indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. And that is binding on Canada under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which in their Article 1 all recognize the right to self-determination. Canada is a party to them. They are known as the decolonization covenants. That's the basis upon which we have to start acting. Recognizing indigenous peoples as decision makers regarding their whole territory. Not 0.2%, not 5% as under the BCTC land selection model, which is still based in extinguishment. That's what Russ took us to. Russ took us to the extinguishment processes and models and how they still violate international human rights standards. And the whole land selection process doesn't recognize that this underlying title is indigenous peoples and that this is all indigenous land. And so basically, that's in part why I went to the UN. And I actually want to make a brief point because I had a question. On your poster, you have in the title, Unsettling British Columbia, the "un" in brackets. And I want to say, why do you have brackets? And I actually got my pen out. Using my international experience from international negotiations, and I square bracketed the round brackets. Because I think we shouldn't have "un" in brackets, rather we should have it in caps. And we are actually on the poster, when the poster comes up for the National Day of Action that Russ talked about, you'll see that it says Unsettling Canada, and the "un" is capitalized. And in part it is because we intend to take the issue also to the United Nations, so the UN. And so invoking these international human rights standards is actually a way of challenging that colonial paradigm. And so I think we should scrap the brackets and capitalize it, and really all work together. And I also want to address the question about what are we all gonna do about it? What can we as academics do, etc. I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything. So I want to tell you first in part though what Art did. And the reason why he took these issues international was not so that he would get a higher standing. He was a really, really humble person, and it was never really like about him as a person, but really about the struggle, the cause. He would call Russ, and he'd often say, "Did you get the land back yet?" So that's what Art was organizing around. And around the land issue, from the ground to the international level. I have seen him speak from back home in his territory to his family, to his people, all the way to the international level. When you hear him speak at home, you hear the love and the caring in his voice. When you would hear him in Ottawa, sometimes it was the advocate who was really putting his foot down, who had a fierce voice and who would speak the truth, who would speak to the colonial paradigm, who would see it and analyze it and call it for what it is. No sweet talking around it. And I saw him internationally when he spoke to those issues. And you know what I saw? When he went international, we went to Europe often, to Asia, to other places. They treated him like a person who owns land, or they treated indigenous peoples as the legitimate owners of those lands. It's only in Canada where it gets denied. And sometimes I feel really bad for indigenous peoples and technicians. Ray was talking about it in the sessions about referrals, how you can keep getting caught up in the system that does not recognize indigenous peoples as landowners. It continuously confronts you with the government being the final decision maker. It can be extremely frustrating, but you step out and you go to the international level. We went to a meeting with the European Commission after our amicus curiae briefs had been accepted before the World Trade Organization, and they really wanted to hear from indigenous peoples and how to deal with indigenous proprietary interests. They treated him like indigenous peoples own the land, and they recognize it, because otherwise, how else can Canada claim this land? Only based on colonial paradigms, right? So, and that was also beautiful to see, and often we would take that message back. So the reason he went international in large part was to keep his people safe. To protect, to stand, because he would always stand behind, especially the Secwepemc women. You see his daughter there carrying on the torch before the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues with a placard that says Canada lies, 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 when Canada was claiming that they are fully implementing prior informed consent, when we know they have just unilaterally approved the Kinder Morgan pipeline against Indigenous opposition. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation has made it very clear they haven't engaged in proper engagement and decision-making processes with Indigenous peoples regarding all these developments. So it is a lie. But he would stand behind these women, the Indigenous water and land defenders, who were taking a very strong position on the ground. And he didn't want them to be vulnerable. He didn't want them to be exposed to what he would always describe as indicators of colonialism, or he would actually refer back to the UN. The UN says the indicators of colonialism are dispossession, the land gets taken, and if you raise what does it create? Dependency. The dire conditions that Yadin was talking about. And then, if you stand up against it, oppression. And that's why he was going international, to raise it to that level and to provide protection for Indigenous water and land defenders. And so we've done a lot of that work together, and we intend to carry that work on. Since Art's passing, we have continued to organize the events he was working on. Russ told you he had emails from January 5th when he had to rush to the hospital, that on February 6th, 6th and 7th, we were gonna have a big organizing meeting on the ground to protect and help his people. And we held that meeting. We kept organizing that meeting as hard as it was, you know? And we've kept going since, all the way to the international level. And so what are some of the international avenues we have pursued, and what are some of the things that we will keep doing? So we started off, actually, like I told you when I first came here, I was thinking, oh, I'm just gonna be writing these human rights submissions to international human rights bodies, but one of the problems with international human rights law is often they don't have enforcement mechanism. Which law has enforcement mechanisms? You're hearing a lot about it with Trump right now. Trade law, right? International trade law really is the one area of international law that has enforcement mechanisms. Countervailing duties, anti-dumping tariffs, serious trade consequences. And after what Luis was talking about, when the Secwepemc and Okanagan went out to assert their jurisdiction regarding their forests by going logging, Art was one of them. Art was one of the chiefs who led them into the forest. He got charged by British Columbia. Those charges are still standing against the leadership for asserting their own authority regarding the forests. The case has still not been to trial on the title issue, but Art said in the meantime they are keeping logging our forests, just like in Haida Gwaii. They were gonna just take out the last of the old growth timber, and in the interior they were just gonna keep taking out all the softwood. And so he decided to take the fight all the way to the international level in the US-Canada softwood lumber dispute, and made submissions to the World Trade Organizations and NAFTA. And so I came in and I got to write these submissions to figure out international trade law and how it applies to indigenous peoples. And it probably, like I said, wasn't my favorite area of law because I really have a lot of issues with international trade law, but it shows you how ingenious you can be, and you can turn and use the system against it, right? To show that in this case, Canada, by not recognizing indigenous land rights, was giving a subsidy to the companies that could take the timber from indigenous forests without any payment to indigenous peoples and the indigenous owners of the resource. And you know what? Our amicus curiae briefs were accepted by the World Trade Organization. We happened to be in Geneva when they were accepted, and all of a sudden the government of the US, Japan, India, the EU, all wanted to meet because they had been sent a letter by the WTO, comment on this indigenous amicus curiae brief that says, you know, they own the trees and there's a subsidy here. Never heard of that argument before. What are you going to say about it? So they all wanted to meet with us. And so we did. This was post 9/11. We had a meeting at the US Embassy and Consulate for Trade, or Mission for Trade to the World Trade Organization. And because we had been in meetings for the whole time in Geneva, they kept it open late. It's all in the book. But anyway, so we walked in there and we talked to those trade lawyers, and the US trade lawyers said to us, so really you as indigenous peoples get no compensation from the timber taken from your forest? And we're like, yes. They're like, and Canada is arguing that basically the companies already own the trees as they're growing in the public forest because they've given them those long-term licenses. That's the end. They are saying it's just a tax. Are they really saying that? I'm like, yes. So then they're like, well, this really is a subsidy, right? And so after we walked out of that meeting, we're standing outside the compound, the heavily secured compound, and Art says to me, you know, you were just swimming with sharks. And which is also a code name for lawyers, of course, but those were the real sharks. And I looked at him and I said, oh, I thought it was dolphins. Anyways, I knew they were sharks. And then, as is also in the book, we had to catch a bus back to downtown Geneva because we didn't even have a cab fare. But you know, like, that's how dedicated he has been to the struggle that his dad was in, and that we all continue on together. So those were really ingenious arguments. We've also worked around international environmental law and multilateral environmental agreements. Just in December, we were at the Convention on Biological Diversity in Cancun, Mexico, and talking about prior informed consent of indigenous peoples, because there's actually also in that context of international environmental law binding obligations on Canada to recognize and implement prior informed consent of indigenous peoples regarding access, first of all, to their knowledge, but secondly, to genetic resources. So we did a lot of that work. No, that's good. I'm wrapping up. I promised rest. And so actually what I will do is I'll leave some of the international work to the side, and if there's questions at the end, I would be happy to circle back to that. The one thing I want to tell you about is that we are working on carrying the call to action about unsettling Canada at the national level on July 1st all the way to the UN, because Canada is going up before the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that looks after the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that Canada is a signatory to. And it's an amazing convention because it actually gets economic and social dimensions of racism and dispossession and marginalization. The majority of the committee members are from non-Western countries, and they really understand the colonial context. I would come back from the meetings with them and said, they get it. We just got to go there and really tell the story. And so the nations from the interior of BC are committed. I just got an email from Sharon Van last night, the treaty nations. We're all going to keep working together on continuing to put the pressure on Canada. So we're going to CERD. Skahish is committed to going there and present a submission late July, early August. And really keep... And the Algonquins, sorry, which are not treaty nations. And I've definitely worked with Indigenous peoples across Canada and also internationally. I've had so many Indigenous women who would say, like Deborah Harry, who's worked on the biodiversity issue, she said, Art would always stand with me. And sometimes he was the only one standing behind me when I took a strong position. And so I've seen him do that work all the way from the national to the international level, really based on a deep love for his people, for his land, that he really knew and believed deep in his heart is, in his case, Secwepemc land and Secwepemc territory, and here it is Coast Salish territories, and that's really what he has been fighting for, and that's what we will keep doing, and hopefully all of us together in unsettling British Columbia. The last point I want to make is he also had a real commitment to working together with academics. At the side event that we organized at the CBD in Mexico just in December, he actually talked about how we all have to work together, and one of the main projects that we were reporting about is the work we are doing about implementing Indigenous territorial authority. So we've been working together with academics from across the country, including Kent McNeil, who is one of the leading scholars on Aboriginal title, a lot of Indigenous academics, about what can we do to really implement Indigenous decision-making on a territorial basis over the 100% of the territory on the ground. And so we want to continue that work. Art was really good at seeing the skills that everybody had and inspiring everybody to contribute exactly the best skills that they had to this struggle. So that's the question that he leaves us all with. What are you going to do about it? And so I'm happy to continue that in a discussion with all of you. Kucham.
Thank you, everyone. So this is a kind of continuation of our discussion earlier today. So I guess I'll start how I found out about this conference. I'm currently a PhD student in electrical engineering at UBC. So I'm on the First Nation House of Learning email list, and I was scrolling through the website, the email list, and I saw this Unsettling BC conference at the bottom of the email list, and I was surprised, like, what is this? What's going on here? This is like named after my dad's book, and I don't know nothing about it. So I emailed Nicole and my aunties and all that stuff, and it turns out it was pre-planned, so I'm pretty happy with that. I guess I just have to make a personal comment about education, and in particular Aboriginal education. I took a unique route in electrical engineering, but I think the only reason why I was able to survive the secondary school education and the post-secondary education system is because of my education my dad provided me. Wasn't formal, right? It was outside the typical learning system. But he taught me that Shuswap people have went through this long series of colonialism. That's how come we're poor in our own land, and we're just dispossessed, right? I'll go into a bit more about it, but there's certain historical conditions that brought us all here, right? Because usually in BC there's this tension between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students, or even faculty sometimes, right? And if you don't have a strong knowledge of history, it's hard to overcome that, right? And it gets a lot of people discouraged and they drop out, right? You see it all the time, clear across this province, right? So without that, coming to terms with that, we won't change anything. So this is the map of all the languages in BC. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this. So there's the Shuswap territory, Statlium, Okanagan, the Katmuk, Coast Salish, Chilcotin, Wet'suwet'en, Gitxsan, like all over the province. And these were all like independent nations who had Aboriginal title, right? And self-determination, or form of government pre-contact. And it's interesting that a European sailor could go by and claim the doctrine of discovery, which my dad talks about a lot. And the doctrine of discovery says you could either claim land through war, through treaties, or it's uninhabited, right? So it's surprising that someone could just sail by here, then boom, claim the land here, right? So the Shuswaps during that time they knew nothing about this. I guess they heard about it through the trade. But my elders, my great-great-grandparents, right, 1846, 1820s, it wasn't really too long ago, not too many generations ago, were doing their thing. They were hunting, fishing, trapping, they were doing all their thing. And yet they were, what Canada claims, domesticated. That they domesticated sovereignty during that time, right? And I discussed a bit about the residential schools, the smallpox epidemics, the economic dependence, and the opposed government systems that we have that Canada enforced upon us. So this is the present map of Canada. So right now, Indian reserves amount to 0.2% of land, and the Canada provinces claim 99.8%. But in reality, they claim everything, right? They claim absolutely everything. But what does that 0.2% do to our people? We know what it does, right? It just equates to poverty. So there's this massive inertia, right, or lack of inertia in our communities for development, right? And all that really creates a lot of Aboriginal people leaving the reserves because there's not enough opportunities, like young people who feel trapped on the reserve, but yet want to maintain their culture. But now what Canada attempts to do is they increase programs and services, money and dollars. They think that's going to raise the standard of living. But in the long run, it's not. The $6 billion that they're offering now is only going to last so many years. But then in 30 years from now, what's my son going to do and his son going to do? That money's going to be gone. So we need access to the land, and that's what we really need, and that's how we're going to create so-called reconciliation. So in general, this is the general structure of Canada right now. So Canada is a constitutional monarchy. So we have the Queen of England, has eminent domain over our territories. This is the current belief. Then we have Section 91, which is the federal power. We have Section 92, which is the provincial power. Then under 91, we have Section 24, which is the Indians and land reserved for Indians are hereby vested by the Queen, right? So the Queen is like our ward. So inherently, the Queen owns all the reserve boundaries, right? But then in 1982, we got in Section 35, which my grandpa helped put in place. And this is the story my dad told me about getting Section 35 in. The way it was put in was through two things, through direct action and through international work. So the Indigenous people organized the Constitution Express in Canada, right? And we got up and made awareness, increased the educational level in the province. Second thing is we went international. And then we met with Earl Grey, who was a really powerful lord in London, right, in England, right? We met with him. We said we wanted Section 35 in it. We want Section 35 in the Canadian Constitution. But then Pierre Trudeau actually didn't want Section 35, and he wanted to wipe out Section 35 and Section 24. He wanted to continue on the white paper policy, wiping out Indigenous people. So we're just like, we're equal in the sense that we have minority rights in Canada. So like we also came on a boat with everyone else, and we're equal in that sense, right? But we argued, no, we don't. We want we're distinct and we want our rights recognized. And during that time in London, Britain was also, they experienced decolonization in the rest of the world, like Africa and Australia. So they were decolonizing those other places, in particular Africa. And some of those countries went through social unrest because certain rights weren't recognized. And they understood this internationally. So they made Section 35 put it in place, and he told Pierre Trudeau, if you don't put Section 35 in, or Grace said this, that we won't reappreciate the Constitution, and so it's gonna fall flat on its face. Pierre Trudeau said, okay. So we had to force him to put it in, right? And now they're acting like, yeah, we did this great thing for Aboriginal people, no votes. So we had to get out and fight for that right. So that's where, but then Russ noted earlier that there was supposed to be like legislation. That was supposed to be like fulfilled further, and that never happened, right? So now we're left to the courts to decide what's defined in Section 35. But I think it should be people who are actually defining those rights and not courts. So I stole a whole bunch of slides from my dad. So in general, the bottom of the triangle is not there, right? That's what Canada always attempts to claim, that we only have crown and settler rights and private property, so fee simple land. But we have these Aboriginal treaty rights that are inherent to us, that are given to us by the Creator, right? That the Queen never isn't going to give it to us. It's the Creator that gave it to us. But what is happening now, my dad also always talked about the modern treaty process. The modern treaty process it fundamentally assumes that we have no Aboriginal title. It doesn't exist, and we have to exchange any existing Aboriginal title. We're going to get private property, right? So we're going to get fee simple, right? So that's alienable. That means if you can't pay your taxes, it's going to be gone. So you need sufficient funding if you're going to go that route. I was just at the UN. I was meeting with a lot of other Indigenous people, and in the United States, some places that some of the elders, they moved off the reserve and they couldn't afford to pay their taxes, so now they're getting evicted from their homes because of this. I have to make one more comment on this. So really, what I see the Canadian government attempting to do here, see that Section 35 box is moving under Section 9124. So that's what they're attempting to do, because they're trying to say the Indian Act chiefs, the people who are elected in the Indian Act system, represent Section 35. But we're counter arguing that, saying no, if we are going to realize Section 35 rights, it needs to be from the people themselves, not through 9124. It can't come from that. It has to come from Indigenous people, unhindered from the settler government. That's the only way it's going to work in the long run. Otherwise, you're just covering up the symptoms. So it has to be unhindered. Like, I don't know exactly how it's going to work. It has to come through. Well, we have to work that out together somehow. But that's what they're attempting to do. And the reason why they're attempting to do is because when we get up and do actions on the land as Indigenous people, and we get criminalized, they would say, no, Indigenous people are the hold that title, that they counter-argue and say DIA chiefs actually have that title. So this is the next thing I would like to talk about is the modern form of colonialism. So this represents the modern form of colonialism. That's my elder Irene. We traveled a lot together. We went to the UN. We did a lot of things together, and there she was getting arrested. So this was at the Sun Peak ski resort, where they were planning. They still are planning on expanding the ski resort, but a whole bunch of youth and Aboriginal got together and said, no, that's their source of water. We go hunting up there. There's a lot of deer, berries, and that's where the young people could practice our culture. And here we have it's really a multinational company. It's owned by a Japanese company, right? So a lot of people think it's public land. No, it's not. It's not public land. It's crown land. It's owned by the Queen, and it's going. All the profits are inherently going to Japan. They're going to Tokyo. They're not going and staying in the province. It's not even owned by the Europeans in BC. And same with the logging companies too. The logging companies, those are all owned by Americans, right? A lot of the companies is just disappearing. It's leaving the country. So what I see this is happening is when we say, yeah, we do have our Aboriginal title, we strongly believe that this is there. So therefore, we have a right to go up and say, hey, look, we didn't provide consent for this development, so we have a right to be here. But then the courts, they always counter-argue with the balance of convenience. They go and get an injunction against us, and they say, oh, Nippon Cable out of Japan is going to lose so many $1 million. And we can counter-argue that, say, no, we're how do we put a value on the huckleberry, this water? Like, water's irreplaceable. So they always argue that, and they come up and they arrest us, and that's the concept. That's their response to our implementation of Aboriginal titles. They arrest us. So it's the way I see it. It's kind of like a mini trail of tears. It's a mini trail of tears. Like when Chief Justice John Marshall said the Cherokee do have title in the land, Andrew Jackson said, oh, now that title exists, let's see. Andrew Jackson said, to Chief Justice John Marshall, is that now the title exists, let's see him enforce it, right? So they marched up all the Cherokee and marched them off. So that's exactly what's happening to our people. When we say, no, we want to protect their environment for everyone, so we could maintain our culture too, and we could hunt and fish, and we could pass on those traditions that they arrest us. So that's the modern form, and really, it's all multinational corporations too. It's all people. All the money is leaving the province. So this is another thing I would like to discuss is self-determination. So this is the second one is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is an international covenant, right, which recognizes that peoples have a right to self-determination. They have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So Irene actually and I, we went to the UN in front of the Human Rights Committee, and we argued internationally that we're peoples. Because we're just a peoples, and that's it. We elaborated more, but Canada counter-argued that that we're domesticated peoples. So that means, like, when the Crown asserted sovereignty, we agreed to that. So any of our rights actually still come from the Queen of England, and the Queen of England never gave us rights. It was the Creator that gave us the rights. So that was their argument, right? And it was interesting because it was just Irene and I that went, and I went. I went on my student budget too. So, and then the person from the FN went there, and they weren't taking strong stands. So it's interesting because a lot of people internationally, they don't take those stands, say, yeah, we're a peoples. They always argue for minority rights. They always try to argue, say, no, we're a minority, right? And that's the Canadian government always try to pigeonhole us into it's arguing that that's all we have, right? But no, we always counter argue, no, we have more than minority rights. We have the right to self-determination and a territory. So the first one is self-determination with respect to the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So yeah. Oh, it's already 4:30, so this is my last slide, so I can give Russell time to talk. So this is kind of my idea what a structure would look like within the Canadian framework on how we could unsettle BC and how we could actually work together going forward. So again, we just maintain this structure. We have the Queen of England, 91, 92, Section 35, 91, 24, but then we have something equal to that, right? Just like the two-row wampum or the Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial, like one side's a ranch, this side's a ranch, that we recognize Canada, the nation state. But then we also have our right. Actually, I should have put the 4 directions here, which is like a pan-Indigenous kind of idea, where you have like mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical needs. But here we have land, animals, water, air, and people that we're equal, and we all have relations. But see, they can coexist, and they can be equal and equivalent, right? Yeah. The only thing I guess I'd like to also add is my grandpa wrote a book called The Fourth World, and he said that first there'll be a political revolution in Indigenous communities. So I see the political revolution is getting Section 35 in. And then he said there'll be an economic revolution. So my dad did a lot of work at the WTO and NAFTA. And then there'll be a technological revolution. So I'm an electrical engineer. I like studying semiconductor physics, and that's what I like to study. My next talk will be on that. But then, if we do increase our technology and we do raise our standard of living, so what? Who really cares, right? We have more phones and things like that. But really, what really matters is increasing our moral standards and reconnecting with our culture, right? Because Indigenous culture has co-evolved in this area for 10,000 years, 20,000 years, and we have that traditional knowledge embedded in us to take care of the land. So yeah. So
Put your last slide.
this slide.
Yeah.
This one? Oh, this one. Yeah. So Canada, they're celebrating their 150th year of colonialism on July 1st. So if you think about it, Indigenous people have been here for 20,000 years. You know, I don't know what the exact number. So the percentage of Canada existed for how long we've been here is like 0.2%. Yeah. So we do need to create a form of equality, right? So our young people do have the opportunity to go on the land, and you can see the young person who was selling the raffle tickets. You could see how excited he was. You could see it in his eyes, right? That he was going to go on that canoe journey, right? And that's exciting. And Shuswap people, we want to go hunt and fish. We want to practice our culture, and that's what we want to do. And that's how we're going to unsettle BC and Canada is by working together to achieve those goals. And it's not scary.
I don't know how to follow up on that. I guess, you know, in terms of what Nicole said and Skahich said, the only thing I could really add was what I talked about this morning is one of the main policies that Arthur Manuel fought most of his adult life against was the comprehensive land claims policy of Canada. You know, it was, Doug White mentioned it this morning, the Calder case in, I think it was 1973.
Yeah, same.
And right after the Calder case came down, where the Nisga'a lost on a technicality, but 3 judges said yes, they have title. 3 said no, they don't have it. 4th judge said, well, they didn't ask for permission from the lieutenant governor, so you know he ruled against them. But that was enough for Trudeau, Senior, not Justin, to then decide, well, maybe you had more rights than we thought you had. And you know, they were proposing the pipeline from the Northwest Territories then, James Bay Agreement, the James Bay hydroelectric project was being considered then. They had huge mega projects in the north that the federal government was looking at funding. So that after the Calder case came down, they figured, we better do something. So they issued a land claims policy. Jean Chrétien announced a comprehensive claims policy, a specific claims policy, and claims of another nature. That was their land claims policy. And comprehensive claims were in areas of Canada where there were no historic land treaties. So that's British Columbia, north of 60, Quebec, the Atlantic, those parts of Canada. Specific claims have to do with lawful obligations, you know, where historic treaties were, where there was an illegal taking of land or reserves weren't created that were promised in treaty, things like that. Claims of another nature, that third category, actually they said related to the Royal Proclamation, but they kind of dropped that that class of claims because it really applied to Quebec and the Atlantic and not anywhere else in Canada. But that's the thing, is that this comprehensive land claims policy is a national policy. British Columbia, though, you know, what goes on out here, because there's 200 and some bands versus the 600 and some in the country. And because, you know, the land claims really started out here, the big ones, in the court cases, it affects other regions of the country. Like Louise thought I came from Quebec because I work with 3 Algonquin communities and have for a number of decades now. And they don't have historic land treaties, just like British Columbia. They have Aboriginal title and rights too. And that's why Art worked with the Algonquin chiefs that I worked with too. And you know, he was on this national committee after Delgamuukw, called the Delgamuukw Implementation Committee, to try and change the the comprehensive claims policy. We were going to seek a judicial review to get that policy changed. That was part of the strategy we had. Phil Fontaine, who was national chief, was supporting us. But First Nation Summit was concerned that the BCTC process would be affected if we went to court. And they supported in the 2000 election a new national chief, Matthew Kuncombe from the Grand Council of the Crees, who already extinguished their title in the James Bay Agreement. And so they killed the DISC committee, and we didn't do the judicial review after the Delgamuukw decision, because there's a big gap between what the court said about the legal principles of title versus the comprehensive claims policy. And then even when Chilcotin came down in 2014 and Harper was in power, the Minister Valcourt, Bernard Valcourt, I don't know if you remember him, he retained Douglas Eford, land claims lawyer from Vancouver, to do a review of the comprehensive claims policy, and also a consultation, because they had announced an interim Section 35 policy, which kind of combined comprehensive claims with the self-government policy, because modern treaties, you're negotiating both land and governance through those policies. And so they had an interim policy. Remember that, Louise? And so Douglas Eford went around consulting, and the Algonquin chiefs that I worked with met with him in Montreal. And he consulted and did his report, which came out in 2014. And, or no, it was April 1st, I think. Yeah. It should have been a joke. Yeah, it should have been a joke. Because all of his recommendations basically recommended keeping the status quo. He never even mentioned the Chilcotin decision in his report, really, of any significance anyway. And that's the policy that basically is still in place technically right now, that the Trudeau government hasn't changed. In fact, the Trudeau government, despite promising a new nation-to-nation process and reconciliation and doing a review of law and policy and everything, they pushed through a referendum in the Northern Shuswap Tribal Council on an agreement principle based on extinguishment and the elements of this old policy. And they also did the same thing in Ontario with an entity that they call the Algonquins of Ontario that they created. There's one status Indian band, recognized band in Ontario called Pikwakanagan or Golden Lake. And they created these 9 satellite groups that they call collectivities. And there's about 7,000 people in those collectivities. And they just had a referendum on an agreement principle. And there's overlaps with the Algonquins that I work with on the Quebec side, because the government of Ontario and the government of Canada are trying to use the Ottawa River as a boundary. They're saying there's Ontario Algonquins and Quebec Algonquins. But that was never the case. The Ottawa River was never a boundary. It was a highway for the Algonquins. But the provinces were created on top of the Algonquin territory, including the national capital was created out of Algonquin territory. It's all unceded territory. And so our staff at the Tribal Council, the Algonquin Nation Secretariat, looked at this referendum, the voters list, and they looked at about 3,000 of the 7,000 of them, and they found out that they hadn't intermarried with Algonquins in 200 to 300 years. Yet the definition of Algonquin is so broad that they're included in there, and they're getting to vote. They have interim rights to hunt and fish. They have rights to vote in a referendum. They'll have beneficiary status in the modern treaty if it gets ratified. They are using these 10 root ancestors, which also happen to be the ancestors of the Algonquins that I work with on the Quebec side. And so here they are, they're going to be impacted by this modern treaty, which is extinguishing all this land in the Ottawa Valley, including in Ottawa, Parliament Hill, the Supreme Court buildings on unceded Algonquin territory, the Governor General's house, the Prime Minister's residence. All these federal buildings are all on Algonquin territory. And they're not all at the negotiating table, but they're going to be impacted by this claim if it goes ahead. And you know, this policy, which the government's using since 1973, after Calder, has created basically three classes of First Nations. One is First Nations that have entered into comprehensive claims agreements. Most of those are north of 60, the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, of course the James Bay Agreement, you know, now the Nisga'a. Then there's First Nations who were or have been in comprehensive claims negotiations, who are in them, you know, the BCTC. And there are First Nations who have never agreed to that policy, agreed to negotiate under that comprehensive claims policy. And there aren't too many of those. Those are, I would say, the South Central Interior bands who never agreed to the treaty process, and the Algonquin communities that I work with. A few in Ontario that haven't gone to the table. But other than that, wherever Canada could get people to the table, they've done that. And including the Algonquins of Ontario, which is really a fiction that they created for negotiations. And I mentioned these preconditions. I just wanted to go through them, because I only mentioned a couple of them this morning. But they have what they call federal core mandates, or, you know, which are really key goals or clauses. And these are in all it's in Nisga'a and all, you know, it's in all the ones that they want to sign, including the agreement principles of the Northern Shuswap and the Algonquins. So these are, they want to get consent to the extinguishment or modification of Aboriginal title. I mentioned that this morning. They want to get consent to the legal release of Crown liability for past violation of Aboriginal title and rights. Louise can correct me if I'm wrong, if I come up with anything wrong here. They want to get consent to the elimination of Indian reserves by accepting lands as private property or free simple. They want to get consent to removing the on-reserve tax exemptions. They want to get consent to respect existing private lands, third-party interests, and therefore alienation of Aboriginal title in title territory without compensation. They want to get consent to be assimilated into the existing federal and provincial laws, which is their self-government policy, where you have to accept the existing constitutional framework, meaning Section 91 and 92 powers, which means you have to harmonize your laws, which are really only local laws, is all left over. And you have to consent to the application of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms over governance and institutions in all matters, which is promoting individual rights versus collective rights. I mean, it was my understanding that's why Section 35 was outside of the Charter, was to protect, you know, the Aboriginal treaty rights. They want to get consent to program funding on a formula basis being linked to own source revenue. So in other words, they want you to raise monies either through companies or taxation or service fees or whatever. And as you raise monies, they're going to reduce the federal transfer payments. You know, so you make money, they reduce it. So you know, you don't really get ahead. Yet some people have signed modern treaties under accepting these conditions. And the thing I wanted to talk about was Chilcotin gives us an alternative now, because really, even though I see some problems with the Chilcotin decision on the bans that I advise, there's two options now. It's either negotiate or litigate. If you negotiate, you got to accept these preconditions, because the only game in town is the comprehensive land claims policy, not only in British Columbia but right out to the Atlantic coast. And that's what all these groups are doing. They're at these tables, is they have to accept these preconditions, including the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseets and the Innu Nation in Quebec and the Atikamekw in Quebec. You know, these are all the nations that are at these tables. I call them termination tables, because that's what you're doing, is you're terminating your rights. And over 400 of the 600 bands in the country are at what I call termination tables. So 2/3 of the bands in the country are already there. So 2/3 of the chiefs that show up at these AFN assemblies are co-opted in these tables. So you see where I'm going, you know, Trudeau's got them right where he wants them. So you can say nation to nation reconciliation. But he has these 40 exploratory tables, and he won't say who they are. We know they're First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but he won't say who they're negotiating with, but they're trying to get them to settle under these existing policies so that they can use them as precedents. Probably in that law and policy review to say, okay, this is going to be a reconciliation framework, because that's what they promised, is come up with a national reconciliation framework. But they're doing all this by stealth. They're not being transparent and open about this. And given the history of the Liberal Party, you know, from the white paper to now, I don't trust them. I don't care if they have an Indigenous member of parliament or a justice minister. If they're so honest, why don't they bring it out in the open like I was? But, so if you only have two choices, either litigate or negotiate, if you want to litigate Aboriginal title, then you really have to prepare the evidence. If you look at the legal tests the court laid out, and I worked on the traditional use study from Misconnet and Adams Lake, and in the Harper Lake logging case, what did they say? That's not good enough for title. You know, you need this whole pile of documents that, you know, costs, like I say, millions and millions of dollars to collect. Because if the burden of proof is on the Aboriginal group who's asserting they have a Section 35 right. So that means you have to collect all this historical documentation from contact and ethnographic evidence, cultural evidence, to show that you meet the legal tests of proving title, you know? And these are the things that most bands can't do, because the money that they get, most of them get it from their dependent, which is part of the definition Nicole was talking about, colonialism, dispossession, dependency, oppression. They're dependent on federal transfer payments, which have terms and conditions that say you have to deliver essential programs and services. You cannot use that money to go to court with unless we say. And you know, even negotiating land claims, you have to borrow money to negotiate, you know, comprehensive claim. And so really it's blackmail, in my opinion, especially in light of the Chococo decision, because you'd think that they would amend the comprehensive claims policy if Trudeau was being honest about nation to nation and reconciliation. He'd look at that Chococo policy and say, geez, we have to stop extinguishment and denial and go with recognition and affirmation like the Constitution says. But they're not doing that. They're pushing these referendums, trying to get deals on agreement principles under these old policies. And they aren't suspending the negotiations and saying, okay, we have to come up with a new policy that's fair and consistent with Chococo and with the constitutional principles. So that should tell you something right there. The fact that they're not doing that is, to me, a clear indication that First Nations are in basically an undeclared war of attrition, where they're trying to wear us down, starve us out, get us to accept the terms and conditions of their land claims and self-government policies. And that's what they're going to fill Section 35 up with, because remember I said they argued Section 35 was what the metaphor was: empty box and full box. The National Aboriginal Organizations in the 80s said Section 35 is a full box, and the government said, no, it's an empty box and you have to fill it up with agreements. And so that was mostly on self-government, but it really means Aboriginal and treaty rights, the same thing too. And with extinguishment of Aboriginal title, they have 3 legal techniques. One is called certainty and finality clauses. You know, that was in the Nisga'a agreement. And the other is modified and release, which is what they're using in the Algonquins of Ontario, and I think the Northern Shuswap agreement principle. That means you have to modify title or extinguish it and then release the crown from all the past bad things that it did to you. That's the deal. And then the other one is the non-assertion of rights, and that's for the government, the non-land related ones, where they want you in a modern treaty to agree you're not going to assert your constitutional rights of jurisdiction or governance. You just will go with what the terms of the modern treaty says, and let the crown governments do that. So these are all the things that we're up against, which is why we have to go internationally to expose Canada and say, you know, they're violating our Indigenous human rights, and they're not being fair. That's why we have to go to CERT. They're discriminating against us by denying our Indigenous human rights to even property, you know. And you know, they need to. There needs to be some international oversight. Skahish went so far as to say at the United Nations, and I agree with him, that the UN declaration needs to become a convention, because then a convention is legally binding, and Canada has to then fulfill it, or, you know, there's consequences internationally. That's the problem, is they're playing fast and loose with words, with the declaration, because they're even talking about how they're going to make Section 35 a full box. You know, I've heard that from the Justice Minister, and I've heard that from the Indigenous Affairs Minister. So they're trying to use words to say that the policies that they're using is that they're revamping. In other words, in my parlance, they're rebranding termination to be reconciliation, but really it's the same thing. But they're hoping that First Nations will be worn down enough to say, okay, we agree. Maybe with some tweaking, a little bit extra money here and there. But the problem I see, and this is what Art was saying, and I agree with him, one of the solutions is the 0.2% is we need to have expanded land base to have more of an economic base, and we need to have our jurisdiction, our internal sovereignty recognized, to make our own mistakes, to make our own decisions about how we're going to manage the territories and govern ourselves. And we have to undo the damage of the Indian Act, because the Indian Act has done damage to each and every band in the country, some more than others. Some bands have embraced the Indian Act, some have resisted it. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, because each band has to start from their own experience to get out of where they are to where they want to go. You know, that's self-determination. But they need the freedom to do that in a constitutional framework in the country, which is again why I think that there needs to be maybe a First Ministers Conference or something laying out some broad principles until we can get maybe a full convention to amend the Constitution, which will take a while. But I think that's the only way that we can get the equality that Skahish is talking about, is restructuring Canada to address the unfairness of its history, of how we've been dispossessed and made dependent, and in order to, you know, give us some justice and fairness in resolving this so that we can have reconciliation, we need to restructure. And, you know, what I'm saying is not heresy. It's exactly what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said, you know, in 1996. You know, they spent $56 million on the study, and then they tossed it on the shelf, and nobody even looks at it anymore. But I still think it's a good reference book, because they studied every frickin' thing, right from contact to, you know, modern arrangements. And it all came about as a result of conflicts with my community, Gunnesadage and Gunnawagi, you know, where they called the army in on us. So that's the oppression part that Nicole was talking about as conditions of colonization. And the reason why they brought the army in is because our people were declaring sovereignty, saying you're not building this golf course in our burial ground. In fact, we called it the Gulf War. And, you know, but that's what triggered the Royal Commission report and the need to talk about a fundamental change in the relationship. And like Skahish said, Art's approach was direct action and international action, and we're continuing that tradition with this National Day of Action and this UN action in Geneva. And then we'll have to figure out our next steps after that to keep building the movement, because, you know, I'm a grandparent, he's a parent, we all have generations coming that we need to think about too. Anyways, that's my addition.
Especially thank our panelists and thank the organizers for allowing these ideas to come together, and especially thank all of the time that you put into making the life that you are making to stand up for the land in the way that you do. And I want to thank your partners, who I know have sacrificed for you to do what you do. And as well, I want to acknowledge the Manuel family in my own way, just to say that, you know, I really think that we saw people go too early because of heart, but I think there's, when we were in Ottawa during the Constitutional Express, George had a heart attack, and Bobby died of lung-related disease, and so did Vera, a very, very, very talented healer and storyteller and filmmaker, died also of lung disease, and of course his heart. And I just think that what we've seen with this family, I truly believe that colonization took great leaders and great warriors and great storytellers too early from the weight of intergenerational grief and ancient sorrows. And art's never going to be an elder, except in the way that he'll live on through us. Just a family with such a huge, huge heart, change makers in a transformative movement, in a landscape of possibilities, continuing to push the options so that the children and grandchildren can be the fierce forces that they are, pushing the boundary of opportunity and possibility. And I wanted to circle back to something that Skahish said, which just triggered something when he said it, when he put up that amazing chart of his ideas about nationhood, and go back to something that, this was a resolution of the UBCIC chiefs in November of 1980. This was right after we had been in George's office and he had been given a brown paper envelope, and of course it had been slipped to him. And what the envelope said was that it was a confidential cabinet document, and what it said was that Native leaders realized that entrenching their rights are going to be enormously difficult after the Constitution is patriated, but that was the strategy of the Chrétien-Trudeau government, is to patriate first and talk later. And they say there's likely to be a major effort by Canada's Native people to win national and international support, especially at Westminster, for their stand against patriation. If the Native people press forward with their plans, and if they succeed in gaining support and sympathy abroad, Canada's image will suffer considerably. And then the report, or this piece of paper, goes on to list all of the different ways in which Indigenous people's social status and economic status are so below that of other Canadians. And so UBCIC gathered together and they passed a resolution. There was a full support of Chiefs Council to take a stand against patriation. And this was the paragraph that got me. Indian nations understood the Constitution to be a pact among founding peoples, among which we include ourselves. We understand our special constitutional relationship with the federal government to be in the nature of a partnership with the federative system, which was intended to permit us to survive and prosper as Indian nations while contributing to Canada's total development. And so when Skahish put up that diagram, what the chiefs were saying then and what they responded to when George says you're never going to get anything by going bare bones legal or bare bones political. You've got to go legal, political, press. You've got to move together, which is what the Constitutional Express was the best example of. But the underlying point is that the fight was about Canada's Constitution being about cooperative federalism, which is comprised of 3 and not 2 orders of government, and that Canada's law is just one system of authority. Another source of authority is found within Indigenous legal systems, and Indigenous sovereignty existed before contact, and this order of government stands on its own. Its powers don't derive from the Constitution. And I just want to pause there and say that that is basically the ground that the Constitutional Express and those that were part of it and some of the legal cases that followed has actually achieved. I agree with Nicole saying that we haven't completed the colonial paradigm shift. There's parts of the doctrine of discovery that remains embedded, but that ground was achieved because of the manuals, because of the work that was done. But I wanted to also say that when I say I've worked for many generations in the manuals, I have. And one generation that I worked for was the kids. And this is Kanahu's, all of the kids that stood up at Sun Peaks. You saw the elders, the picture there. And but it wasn't just Sun Peaks, like building cabins at the Gilver Lake and having the Crown come and burn them down. I mean, this is the way that the kids were carrying the torch, was to actually stand up their laws. And so the piece that I wanted to leave with you is what we've been summarizing is that Indigenous people implementing Indigenous laws are the conditions for bringing about reconciliation. Human rights are the ground that will rebuild Canada and will lead to reconciliation. Crown recognition isn't required to possess land and resources and exercise governmental law-making authority. These powers already exist within Indigenous communities and nations, and Section 35 can't revitalize Indigenous laws unless self-determination informs the approach. And I say this because Indigenous people can't alone force the agenda so that the comprehensive claims policy is repudiated, so that, you know, Indigenous laws and legal orders can coexist on an equal and human rights plane with Crown laws and legal orders, so that mechanisms to build free, prior, and informed consent will be something which we all look forward to achieving. This is the kind of momentum which requires all of us. We all have to be part of that. It's not just a struggle of Indigenous people. And I just wanted to circle back and thank you for listening and for all of what you're doing and saying. And I wanted to also just, I know that it's a bit, Russ was talking about, you know, we've got two options, litigation or negotiation. One of the things I keep hearing, and I do want to stop and say it, is that when you go to court to prove, when you go to court and Indigenous nations have to prove title, they don't have to prove anything in terms of what they have to do. If they only have to prove their prior occupation if they want a remedy. The court isn't granting them title. They've got title. Title exists. We've already been through that ground. We've been through that ground in Calder and Guerin. Aboriginal title is inherent, it's pre-existing. The courts have said Indigenous laws pre-existed and survived the assertion of sovereignty. They haven't been extinguished. They are fully expressed in Section 35. We do already have a lot of ground that we've made. So it would, rather than to get into this business of the Crown just laying back and saying, well, you know, prove it then. In other words, they're saying, go get a remedy. In other words, they're saying we won't implement the law. That's where we all come in, to be able to force the Crown to create the conditions so that Indigenous people implementing their laws are the conditions for reconciliation and not the conditions to call in the cops. So I just wanted to leave you with that, and again, thank you so very, very much for the whole day with you. Sure.
Thank you very much, all of you, for throughout the day telling us a little bit more about Mark Emanuel's work and the work that continues in his name and went on before him. I think it's given me, and I suspect all of us, a greater appreciation for what all that work has been and how tough a fight it is to persist against the government and people that talks a good game, but very rarely goes beyond talking a good game, and trying to get down to playing a good game and actually playing a fair game once and all. So thank you again for all that work, and Godspeed, and all the powers and spirits and whatever. So I suspect that the panel is willing. I think I didn't actually run by them, but they're probably willing to answer some questions now. But there are multiple things going on that right now, starting at 5. Down just beyond the library at building 300, second floor in the Royal Readers Room, there is a book launch going on for 2 new books by people who are here for the conference, Tina Blocks and Lynn Marks Infidels and the Damned Churches, Irreligion and Religion in Southern British Columbia, and Tina Blocks, The Secular Northwest, Religion and Irreligion in the Everyday Cultural Life. So that's going on between 5 and 6. Tonight at 7 o'clock, if you haven't had enough of a day yet, there is a film being shown called Surviving Disaster. I think the committee was feeling a little bit like that early this morning.
And you did.
Well, yeah, I think we did. So there's that film, and then we reconvene tomorrow morning, 8:30. The registration desk opens up. 9 o'clock, the sessions begin for another full day. So thank you, and if you want to hang around and the panel is willing to we'll do some Q&As, you're more than welcome to hang out, and if not, we'll please do.